welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod, and today we'll be talking about how to draw a Harpy eagle. As always, I'm using a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet, and I'm drawing straight into Photoshop. So, let's get arting. Alright, here is the Harpy eagle. So they have some light gray, they have some dark gray, so we're just going to get started kind of here by the nose. Like always, right, we're going to have a feather, and one in between. That's how we're going to build it up. And they have some different angles of their feathers happening. They're interesting looking birds. Some theorize they're responsible for some legends of creepy creatures. They look almost like humans when you see one. Like a pretty big, and they have this like creepy sort of rounded face when their back feathers really splay out. It's interesting. But yeah, so we're building that up. Always one in between. This is still a sketching step. All I'm doing here is sorting out what direction the feathers are going. And then we'll add shadows and highlights after we get all of these sort of sorted out. Again, a very kind of flat face, so a lot of potential for a lot of good highlight on it. I don't think there's going to be a lot that's really going to be interfering. The front of their face is kind of this light gray with some dark gray mixed in, and then all of these back feathers are dark gray. And yep, just building it up. They have dark around the eyes, so we're going to do all of that in gray. It's easier that it's gray. Don't have to worry about, you know, it being black. It's hard to do black sometimes. Oh, that's some gray in there. And then the feathers just kind of splay out as you go around. Alright, you have it coming. Although like a lot of birds, you know, you have this section down here where it comes up, follows the eye up till you get to kind of this midpoint, and then it turns. And then it'll be going more straight out from there. And it's okay if the lines don't match up perfectly, right? That there's some overlap into the different colors. I may not have all of this coming down this like secondary line. I haven't decided on that just yet. Doesn't really need to be there. Some of this though, I mean all of this we'll need, because that'll add, that just sort of adds, makes a Harpy eagle a Harpy eagle. Even though we're doing it kind of like fur, it'll still read as feathers. That's what's so interesting about how our brains kind of fill in information. We know it's a bird, and so even though it looks more fur-like, when we add highlights and shadows, it'll still give that illusion it's feathers to us. And down here we're coming straight down off that beak and angling it out. Right, so this sketching step, it's just a way to avoid line conflicts, because line conflicts are something that are in this style really easy to accidentally do. In areas where you add highlight, they won't be as noticeable as in areas where you have shadow, and then they can be noticeable, so it's just as easy. You know, you don't have to, when you're adding shadows and highlights, I won't have to think about what direction all of that's going. Okay, so now we're going to do the dark gray, which isn't all that much darker. Follow the lines we already did. So right here the feathers actually kind of run together and into each other before they sort of straighten themselves out. But we're still following the lines we've kind of already done with the other color, right? We're still following one feather in between, one line in between. And just build that up. And then we'll have those big feathers kind of coming off the back of the head too. Won't be big color change. It'll be subtle, but it kind of is subtle, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. Right, still following those same contours. Same thing on this side. And then as these other feathers kind of come off, and around the nose and the mouth and all of that too. Right, so we have these guys. Oh, that was a little overzealous. Gonna follow a little bit more of the feather for these, kind of coming off the back. But that's not all that hard to do. You just kind of go to the edge and loop it down, right? You have one coming down the middle and then the rest of it kind of looped. Like it's coming back in. Depends on the shape of the feather. In this case, I don't think I certainly didn't draw it so that the feathers were splayed out. Just the act of stopping the stroke will make it more visible to us. We'll be able to kind of see exactly where these are. Right, coming straight down, and then you can see I'm looping it one side and then to the other side. Straight down and then looping it. Yeah, they're such interesting birds. They can also lay their little fluffs down. They look more eagle-like, hawk-like when their feathers here are more down. But they look so distinctive when their feathers are all splayed out like this. Let's see, I can kind of taper that off. I think I can leave that as is and do kind of the same thing on this side. Figure out where to cut that off. And then sort of build it up as to what's where. But also make it a little asymmetrical. That's interesting too. Alright, so if I pop that off, yeah. It's always a good idea to keep an, sort of keep an eye on exactly how it's looking. That's why I always pop off that sketch layer. I want to know exactly what I'm doing and how it's looking and does it look right or not. It can be easy to get distracted and maybe not do the best at, sort of a pulled away view. It's easy to hone in on one spot and that look right, but that might not look right when you look back at the whole thing. How all of the elements play together is just as important as how they play individually. There's a lot of interesting look to these guys. Not like the usual birds. You can really see that down though, right? Straight down, that one coming straight down in the middle, and then looping to the right when I go off to the right from that. And then looping to the left when I go off to the left from that. And over here we're already looped. We're already past the center point, so I'm already just gonna loop it. Alright. Now, it's just a matter of determining if I think this is a good balance or if I should bring this down any. I guess I could. They have several layers. Pull this out just a little bit. Then I can pull this too. Maybe some of this. Or they're kind of built on top of each other. I know I erased that out, but give me a chance to do that too. Alright, so if I pop that off, yeah, we'll see. I might take some of these back off. Especially this last guy. I'm going to erase that out. This one down here. I don't think we need it. It starts looking like, you know, when I back out and take that sketch layer off, it kind of starts looking like his whole face is surrounded. Which it is, but not in this nice symmetrical clean line, and so I don't want that to happen. That's what I mean when I pull back to look. Don't want it to look like his whole face is just surrounded. But it's kind of, it's close to being balanced like this, so yeah, I think we're gonna give that a go, and then we're gonna add the gray around the eyes. So eyes you have to be very careful on. It's the first thing that we look at as humans, as animals in effect. We're drawn to eyes, so making sure that's a nice clean line around the eye is important. Changing the shape of one of them just a little bit. To try and match the shape of the other. I don't know that it would be so noticeable, but I notice it, so could be noticeable. Yeah, I think already you're getting the sense of the Harpy eagle. Alright, and now for the beak. Birds often have, that's what this is, like a little ridge in their beaks. I don't really know if I'm going to show that. I drew it in because they have it, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to do it. So much as I just thought it was interesting. See, this is a spot where you could have line conflict, so I just need to make sure they reconcile in. And then the direction changes. A couple coming down, and then it'll sort of all be the, you know, the top beak is all of this top section, so I have you coming in and then it looping off, kind of changing direction a bit as it comes down. Same over here, looping off, changing direction a bit as the contour changes. It'll start matching these over here. You have the nostrils on both sides. And then I'm going to stop the line and restart it where that little ridge is. Nothing may come of it, but we'll see. Keep in mind you have this angle to also consider. And where that beak is turning. And then, you know, over here where it's coming in. I may actually have to keep, don't often do this, but I may have to keep the sketch layer on. Just because I don't know that I can see the difference in color. It's light enough at this point that I can't pick out the gray in here, yeah. So when we add shadows and highlights, I'll have to leave the sketch layer on. So sometimes at the beak tip, I'll do the same thing that I do up here. I have the one coming down and then angling it. That helps keep it from being such a sharp tip because they often have sort of a roundness to them. Okay, so that's the top of the beak, right? Looks almost like he's smiling. Now we'll add the bottom. This does connect around the edge of the mouth. Just back right over here. This connects all the way through. And that difference in angle will help visually, right? Like we have this ramming into the top beak, kind of, that line's coming straight into it. That'll tell us it's something different, right? When I take that off, you can see that change. It tells us something else is happening here. Alrighty, now we have this lighter gray color. I'm going to have the light source coming from above and to the right. right, coming in this way. As always, that means it's above and in front of. It's not behind or next to. That just, you know, I always consider, 9 times out of 10, that's going to be your best way to highlight your subject, is have it above in front to the right or to the left. It's totally up to you and how you think your subject will best be highlighted. But, you know, like if his face were turned to the left, I might adjust that. You know, if he's looking off this way and his beak is like pointing in this direction and he's turned a little bit, I might have it coming from above and to the left, because I want my subject to be highlighted as nice and neat as possible so that he gets, you know, the most focus. And so my light source is going to kind of determine that. Okay, so when I'm doing a highlight, it's full pin pressure, right? So all of this would be full pin pressure. And then wherever we do, also tipping this in because we have that section where it goes in, wherever there would be shadow, we really back off the pin pressure. Right, so all of this clearly highlight. Just following the lines we've already done, so at this point I don't have to think about the direction the lines are going. Now his face is pretty forward facing, so a lot of his face is going to be in highlight, but we have the beak to give some shadow, and then inevitably all edges are in shadow, and this side, this back side over here, is going to have more of a shadow than the side on the light source. So let's go ahead and sort out the shadows. Now when you're looking at like a beak or an object like this that's blocking, you have to consider the angle of the light source to determine the angle the shadow's kicking in at, right? So you have a light source coming from here, which means this would be casting a shadow here, right? We continue that line through. That's how you kind of determine it. So that's, you know, up in here, it's backed off pin pressure. I'm not going all the way to the tip because the tip is forward. It's not right against his face. So that wouldn't have, in fact, I probably brought that in too much. The tip isn't going to have shadow right here. It's going to start a bit back and then sort of take over, right? So I'm going to start it back in here. All of this would be in shadow, and it's going to angle down, right? Because that's the direction the light source is above and to the right, so that's kicking the shadow down this way. And bearing in mind that as we come off, at some point the beak's going to jut forward, so we're probably going to shift this angle a little bit too. Have it coming down. Right, it's coming down, and then we'll have this more extreme descent as it kind of gets to an area where you'd have some shadow anyway. Right down in here. And then this edge would all be in shadow, so it's all backed off pin pressure. Make sure it's over enough as well. There's probably even a little bit of shadow being cast by you know, part of this beak too, although you still have, this is still jutting forward, so this is still casting that shadow down. It's changing a bit because that angle's changing, but it's still casting that shadow down. And then we start tapering that off right around in here. Still going to have a shadow as a result of his beak. But all of this is going to be that beak pushing forward. And we'll taper off and sort of fade those edges in, make them look nice and neat. But, you know, as you're doing highlights and shadows, it's not just more pin pressure that'll add a highlight, but more lines. So keep that in mind too. It's really easy to put a few too many lines and create a highlight. Right, and then all of this backside. So we're going to have a nice big tip of feathers with shadow, because on the other side we're going to have some shadow. We want this to distinctly look like the shadowed side. It'll help with the beak, but it's not as dramatic as some animals who have the normal contour because of how flat their faces are. Make them a lot, it's part of what makes them look so human-like. They have very flat, circular faces. And then, same is true for underneath, because it's underneath. It's running into more feathers, but this is kind of the edge of his face, so you have his neck feathers kicking in, so there would definitely be a distinctive, you know, shadowing on the bottom. So if we pull back, that's what we have so far. So I'm going to do a ring all the way around with this lighter gray, and I will be right back. Alright, so you can kind of see, right as I start getting over here, I start thinning this out. It is nice, though, to leave yourself like a little bit of a runway. And I just noticed sometimes they'll, you know, when you put your hand down, oops, I know, it'll create a dot. I try to watch out for those, but sometimes they squeak through. Sometimes I do all the shadows first, though. I just find it easier because that's then one less thing I have to think about. Yeah, I think their faces are flat enough. Probably the rest of the face is in highlight, with the exception of maybe right by the beak, where you probably have a little bit of shadowing, just where this is probably jutting forward a bit. Really close. So this is just where there would be a dip underneath it. So the beak itself is right against the face, is casting that little bit of shadow. There may even be, considering the bottom of the beak, that angle, you know, extending this angle out, starting back here, but not being as dramatic as we were once the big beak started coming off on the front side. That angle would change. Okay. Now we just have to make sure that we blend it all together. That'll be the hardest part, but otherwise it's full pin pressure. Again, I have this on, the sketch layer on, so that I know where the color changes are, where I've drawn them, because it's hard to see. The colors are subtle enough. But we're back to full pin pressure as we bring this up and over. And this is going into his eye, or the skin of his eye. Again, just following the contour, right? We've already drawn it, so the hard work is really already done. Now it's just sort of the longer process of filling it in. And then as we bring it over, again, being careful where our highlights and shadows are connecting in. Right, so as we bring this up, once we get over to here, we don't want this to be a jarring transition. So I'm actually not putting full pin pressure here, but I'm putting more than I did when I added the shadow. Might still have to blend because you can kind of see it, but just that little bit of extra pin pressure as I pull it off, and then we'll really brighten it up. Right, now we're off. Now the highlights really kick in. And we don't want there to be like this, you know, you can kind of see it up here even. So I'm going to have to fill this out even more. You don't want that, basically. You don't want this clear line between highlight and shadow. So And that's even being mindful of it. So I'm going to come up in here and just add more lines in. Like I said, adding more lines brightens it up. So I'm not going to put more pin pressure, just more lines to taper this out. Make this look a little bit more natural. And then continue connecting it in. And then if I take once I connect this, I'll take the sketch layer off, see how it's looking. That'll give me a better idea. That's why I don't like to work with this on, but sometimes the colors are so close together it makes it difficult to do any other way. Not the first time I've had to do it. I do think I'm going to have, yeah, you can see this overlapping, so I'm going to taper this out too. Even in areas that are highlight, adding in more lines brightens it up, right? So if I have a spot that's a little awkward, I can still brighten it up around it to help mitigate what I've done. Take off any lines that might be a problem. So I don't want that line to show up. But now that I've brightened that up, I need to brighten the rest of this up. So adding more lines with more pin pressure in an area like this, where there's still a lot of pin pressure already happening. Right, so that's a pretty good start. And you can kind of see the change in the darker, it's just harder. I think it's going to look interesting. Alright, so I'm going to fill in the rest of his face in highlight, and I will be right back. Just following, you know, the lines I've already done. So, and now that the shadows are in place, it's just a matter of blurring that in like we just did, and following these lines, and yeah, I'll be right back. All right. So there we go. Just gonna feather this in a little bit more. Huh. No pun intended. So it looks a little bit more natural. See how that really fades in nicely. I find it best when I'm doing an edge, you know, to give myself a runway, so sometimes I'll extend out that shadow. That's what I do when I'm doing that. And then I can really push that highlight into it. Okay. So now we have the dark gray. Their eyes can be gray or brown, and I honestly debated on what color to do, but I think I'm leaning towards brown because it'll be so gray, it'll be nice to have a pop of color in here. Okay. So we have a lot of individual feathers here. We should probably get the face first. So all of these guys, for the most part, are going to be in highlight. A little bit of shadowing up here, but right, all of this full pin pressure highlight, and you can kind of see the difference in the grays. So this will show up a nice dark. Yeah, making sure I'm on the right layer. Same thing as we just did. It's kind of subtle. I mean, on some of them it seems like you can see the gray a little bit better than on others, and on others you're questioning whether it's there at all. It's a little darker than this, but This is the mid-tone gray I usually use for black. A little redder. I went into the blue so I could gray this up, add a little bit of difference to it. It looks like it stands out enough. I'll know more once I get all of his face in. Right, and just like down here where I started turning them into each other, here they sort of run together. So if I take that back, oh yeah, you can clearly see the gray, that darker color. Oh good. So even on those thin lines that I do sometimes, like in here, to give it more texture, you know, you can still sort of fill that in. Gives it a burst of color, sort of elsewhere, if you will. Woven in a different way. Won't be as obvious as to where it is. Right, and then bringing these two together. So this is unique in that usually I would say this would create a line conflict, but on a lot of owls you have it too, where owls have it over their beaks. This Harpy eagle has it just above the beak, where his feathers run together. So usually you don't see this on hawks, on eagles, but you do sometimes see it on other birds. So it's not completely unusual to have a situation where the feathers are running together on both sides. Not necessarily creating a nice loop, they're just creating a folded over kind of section there. And then from here we can feather that out in a way that makes sense, right? So bringing that down to a point and then treating it like other areas where I have that line coming straight down in the spot. And then sort of filling in the rest. So once you do that, you resolve the line conflict and you're good to go. So that's the biggest of them, right? Pull that back and we can kind of see it's there. I'll have some shadowing obviously on this side. And like I mentioned on the top, but these two little guys, most of this one, although the top of this one's going to have some shadowing. And then all of these feathers, you know, there's going to be a mix. So this is getting further and further behind his head. So these are probably mostly in shadow, but because of the nature of feathers, they might be pushing forward a little bit. Some of them may have some highlight on them. We'll see once we get to it. But if we do them individually, it'll add some good texture. So I'm going to get all the feathers on his face and I will be right back. Okay, so there's the gray around his face, and then we have all these little feathers, and of course his beak and around his eyes. So on this side, just trying to figure out exactly where I think highlights might be kicking in. Or if I should do the whole thing in shadow first. I'm gonna do at least shadowing down in here. Again, I may come back through with some to change it, give it some highlight. But for now, build in with this shadow. Just following those lines, right? I can kind of tell where the feathers are, which feathers are what based on the direction that they're going, the lines are going, because we have that one in the middle coming down, so I always know where there's a new feather. Shadowing them individually should give them some extra texture, but it will make it a little bit more work to do. It's fine. That makes it more interesting. Gives us a chance to really highlight, you know, individual feathers for some detail. Some of the feathers are bigger than others, so that'll make it a little easier. Right, and this is, like I said, shadow, so it's all light pin pressure. And when feathers aren't splayed out, you want them kind of angled in at each other. Angled in towards the middle. Sorry, not at each other. By each other, I meant the middle. Right, so if I pull back, you get kind of that effect happening. So you can kind of see individual feathers sort of mixed up in there. It's good, that's what we want. And then when we add highlights to it, it'll really help them pop. I feel like I'm going to do all of them in shadow. That'll be the easiest thing. Even the big ones. Yeah, we'll do all of these in shadow, and then we can add the highlights and sort of sort it out, because it's a whole bunch of small individual sections. I feel like that's going to be a bit easier. Before I do that, though, I'm going to go ahead and fix this. I'm going to have this coming down. Some of those edges just need to make sense. Alright, so I'm going to just do all of these in shadow, so that's that light pin pressure, following the contours of the lines I've already done, and I will be right back. Okay, so now that we have his feathers kind of fleshed out, now we can add the highlights to them since they're now kind of all shadowed. Since we've already shadowed them in, I won't have to put a lot of pen pressure, so this is a case where I'm going to be using more lines to create the highlight rather than more pen pressure. The light source coming from above and to the right, like this guy's going to have some highlighting on it. Again, you know, don't have to put a ton of pen pressure because it already has enough to kind of give it some oomph. And then as you bring it down, it's going to go into some shadowing, but it doesn't have to go into shadowing at the top edge here, because that light is probably pushing this. It's probably pushing this into the next line under that feather. And then we kind of repeat for all of them. Light positioning of the lights, not the light source itself, but where the light's hitting on the feathers will change as the feathers shift around his head. Right, so this one, light source still coming from above and to the right, but this one's angled up just a little bit more than this one was. So you're going to have a little bit more highlight coming down on that right side because it's not underneath. Again, you know, it can push into the top of this other feather. With the light source coming from above, it would be, visually to us, be pushing down. That feather isn't blocking it. That feather would be blocking it below its top. And then bringing that over a little bit flatter, so it's probably got a good amount of highlight coming over. All right. Interesting guy. When I do it this way, when I add shadows in first, it gives me a lot more control. That's why I sometimes do it. Because I'm not putting more pen pressure, which means it's not that it's reckless the other way, but it's a little bit more reckless than if I'm drawing lighter. I was trying to say lightly and lighter at the same time. That didn't quite work out. So I have more control when I'm drawing lighter. I'm being just that little bit more mindful of how the brush strokes are filling in. And it doesn't take a whole lot of pen pressure. It just makes it a little easier when you're sorting out exactly where highlights and shadows would be, which is why I did it on the feathers. It creates almost an extra step, right, because I'm having to draw over areas I know are going to be highlight, but it also makes it a little easier sometimes to sort that out. So all these tall feathers would definitively be catching some highlight. As we move down in here, there's going to be some shadowing on some of those feathers. They're not all going to be in the highlight. And then some of these feathers will be casting a shadow behind it, right? We haven't hit that yet because we're still kind of aiming on the side of the light source. So right, all of this would be catching highlight as it goes into, or sort of behind these other feathers. As we start shifting down this way, however, we're going to start getting into a situation where these feathers are casting a shadow, right where they would connect in. Right down in here, this guy probably is casting a shadow now. Not much of one, but it probably would be there. And then this one's definitely casting a shadow on this one, so this is only going to have a partial highlight because he's blocked. So then this has some highlight, but probably blocked at the base now, so I won't be pushing that all the way down. Not blocked on this side though, for this feather. That would be going all the way in, but blocked with this one. And then push, because it's probably kind of behind them just a bit. This one's probably big enough to catch some highlight. Again, not going all the way down. Except on the sides. That wouldn't necessarily have that. Give a little burst to this one, nothing big. It's pretty far back. A little burst to this guy. Would have some shadowing, especially by the head, because we're going into shadow as that head rounds away. And right now this one has maybe a little bit, but again is blocked by the other feathers. Same with this one. Maybe a little bit, but probably also blocked by some of the other feathers. And this one. And now I'm going to give a little bit up here. Not much, but a little. Same with this one. Not much. A little bit. Maybe a little bit. Yeah. I think that'll be good. See, it just gives me that control to sort of taper off how much is getting what and where. Now we'll march back towards the right. Same thing with the head once we get to the top, right? This would be pushing all the way to that. Still trying to leave all edges in shadow though, as I do each feather. Leaf. Huh. It's really, I think it really definitely changes it, yeah? Just adding those highlights. It's amazing what highlights and shadows can do. Before we're done, I'm also back in the other color. I mean, we'll do the beak and the eyes first, but I'm gonna fix this. I think the shadow's a little too dark, so we'll temper that off. It won't be much, just a few light lines to brighten that up. And see, this is behind that other one here. This one is a little bit too, so tapering off that highlight right on the edge. Whereas this one doesn't seem to have anything directly blocking it on the right. I'm bringing that all the way down to the head. And here, certainly be pulling this all the way into the edge of the, gosh, I almost said leaf again. Into the edge of this feather. I don't know why I keep trying to call these feathers leaves. They certainly don't look like leaves. But this one would potentially be casting a shadow down here, so a little bit of a mix happening. So we'll leave a little bit of shadow over here while pushing the shadow in over here. I think I'm gonna have to brighten up some of these guys in here. Not by much, but they don't necessarily look like they have a highlight on them. I mean, compared to these they do, but not compared to this. I'll fix that though. Right, and see, this is still this would still be pushing down into the feathers below it. The highlight. And of course into the side of the face. Just like it did here. Same thing with this one, right? It's pushing right into that side of the face. Because that's exactly the side that the light source would be pushing that feather into. As opposed to the other side where it would be blocking it. It's an awkward angle for me, that this last little feather. Having to sort of shift. Having trouble drawing it. Alrighty. Let's brighten up a few of these others. Just a little bit. Again, not much, because with all these lines, I just need to add more lines, not really a whole bunch of pin pressure. And we don't need to do much because we've already done the bulk of it. It's really just refining it. That brightens it up nicely. I am going to take a few lines and have them coming off. Feathers wouldn't necessarily be perfect in the way that their feathers are coming up. Sometimes there's little pieces coming off. Don't have to do much. Okay. Now, do by his eyes first. I'm gonna do this in shadow by his eyes because it's not a lot of space to work with, and we want to be careful around the eyes, as I mentioned before, right? Eyes are one of the first few things we notice looking at anything. So these lines need to be a little bit more careful than elsewhere. Do the same thing over here. Light pin pressure all the way around. Making sure all these lines, even where it runs straight into the eye over here, is still looking mostly straight. Okay. I'm gonna come down here to this lighter gray real fast. Partly because his beak is not exactly as straight as I would like it to be, so I'm just gonna trim it up on one side to make it a little straighter. And actually connecting this into where the beak actually is. Looks like with that sketch layer on, I clearly left a gap. Did better on this side. Okay, that's straighter. Now, just need to feather that in better. Okay. Now, while I'm here, I might as well lighten up this shadow. Deeper the shadow, either the deeper the valley or the deeper, the bigger the thing casting the shadow. So if you don't want it too much, too deep, too dark, or looking like it's bigger than it is, you can just having trouble with that word. Temper it out. Trying to say temper and taper. My mouth definitely did not like how that was going. See what it's going to do, theory, is make it clear that it's there, but it won't be nearly as dramatic as it currently is. It's a little too dramatic. And, just like before, right, I'm not adding more pen pressure, I'm adding more lines. So that's enough to brighten it up, and if I put more pen pressure, I'm really going to build it up too quickly. See, that really tempers it off. Tones it down significantly. Yeah, see, that looks a little bit more natural. It's not really taken away. The other thing I'm going to do, well, maybe I should wait for, I'm going to do it now. I'm going to push some of these feathers coming up over the eye over here. Yeah, I think that looks a little bit more natural. Okay. Now, I'm going to do this whole thing in shadow. So, you know, light pin pressure, just following the contour that's already there. And I will be right back. Alrighty, now to add some highlights. Come in here on the beak, really push this over here on the right, not on the edge. Again, all edges are in shadow. It does have the kind of that little loop happening here before it angles itself back in. And then push it down, but not all the way down, because that tip is going to be going to shadow where that's rounding away. Again, I've already shadowed it, so this isn't full pin pressure. If I hadn't shadowed it, it would be full pin pressure. It's just adding more lines. It's a little bit more than it was when I shadowed it, but by no means full pin pressure. So bringing this across, all of this is going to be highlight. Really filling in this side. And then we'll be transitioning as we come over kind of the dome of the beak. Right, we get over that hump. As it starts to round away from the light source. So we'll start to back off our pin pressure as it moves over. We're going to have some highlight here on the back of the eye. And you're going to have some highlight under the eye, against the eye itself, because, right, this would be catching the light as the light source is hitting right on that. Over here, not as much, not right against the eye, but this is going to have highlight. Going into shadow by the nostril, highlight right under the nostril, and then pulling that highlight over. Same thing up here with what we did below. Right, good highlight until we kind of cross over, and then tapering that off. Highlight all through here. Now as we get closer to its mouth, right, we need to indicate certainly that it dips down, so there's going to be some shadowing under. That connects back up. And then underneath, I have a little bit catching. Before it transitions quickly into shadow, because it would be angled under. Yeah, okay. We can do some of this. Let's see. On this side, we're going to have a little bit of highlight here, a little bit of highlight on the eye, catching that light source. This is probably, it's flat facing, so this is probably in highlight. Just a little bit. Beak is going to be blocking some of this. Contour is going to be blocking some of this. So as we get close to the beak, tapering that off. Right, we're considering that light source, so it would be coming down at a certain angle. And considering that it's probably angled in, we're going to have a little bit of light, I think, over here, connecting up, and then a little bit underneath. Yeah. Yeah, and that gives you a real sense, right? Like it matches this shadow down here, which is good. So, now we have the eyes. All right. So now for the eyes, which we're going to do in brown. So I mentioned it can be brown or gray, but I thought the brown would add a nice little burst of color. I mean, with the gray, I have this sort of light gray being in the brownish tones and the darker gray being in a bluish tone, so that kind of shifts color, but I think adding the brown will be a nice little pop. So, I always start by drawing in the pupil, right? So I want to make sure it looks like it's looking at us. So I'm just going to kind of do a circle, and I'll fix this up after I fill in the whole thing with the elliptical marquee tool up here, right here. So that's one, and we're going to get the second one in. That was a bad line. It's okay, we're going to be fixing that up. Second one's looking a little rough, but as long as pupil's roughly in the spot, it looks like it's looking at us and it works. So now, I'm just going to take it and fill it all the way around. Right, so as I bring this down, I'm going to be kind of angling this down. It's assuming I leave this black. Sometimes on birds there's so much space I go ahead and fill in the whole thing. I'm going to see how it looks after I get this in to see if I'm going to do that or not. The reason I usually don't do that is you run the risk of making someone or something look surprised, and I don't want it to look surprised. Right, so bringing this down just a little bit. It doesn't have to be an extreme angle down, just a little angle down. It's fine. He definitely has a lot of space, so this might be a case where we have to fill in the whole thing. A lot of birds do. It's one of the few times I typically will circle it in is with a bird, particularly with owls, because their eyes are so big. Dominates so much of their face. Lines don't have to be perfect or straight. You can see mine are all over the place. With eyes, that actually helps a bit because it's gonna, there's a lot of muscles in our eyes. And even though I usually don't draw them in, although we can, I usually don't, because the wobble of my strokes is good enough to sort of mimic what that would look like. Let me pull back. I don't know that he does need it. It definitely looks like a shadow over his eyes. I don't know if it's a little too much. I'll think about it. So I don't know that I want the shadow to look like his eyes are really recessed into his head. I don't know that it does right now. Same thing on this side, right? Start at the top and then sort of angle that down. And then same over here, start at that top and slowly kind of angle that down. Whole lot of real estate in the eye to go through. And then just bring it around. It's the loop is actually a weaker hand position for me. My muscles haven't, when I was drawing when I was a kid, and all the drawing I'd done up until, let's see, I got into digital art about 2012, I would turn my paper, and so I never actually developed the muscle memory to be able to draw a nice loop in certain angles. And while I could rotate the canvas on Photoshop, I don't do that. And so instead I contort my body and or just understand that on certain angles, certain wobbly strokes are either acceptable or not acceptable. And for the eyes, I definitely think it's fun. All right. I'm actually going to bring this up a little bit, change how extreme this comes down. Bump that up. Still want it, right, I still want it on this angle, not this way. So that's important to keep in mind when you're doing eyes. it'll look wrong if we do it this way. So you want it more rounded, you know, like that, where it's kind of dipping down from the center, not coming up from the center. It won't look right. You can do the same thing on this side. Bring this up just a little bit. All right. Gonna shift this eye over just a smidge. Yeah, okay. Now, I'm going to take the elliptical marquee tool. I'm going to come in here, line it up, and hit backspace, and then I'm going to select and inverse that. Make sure that any of these edges I might have accidentally undone are all filled in. Don't have to follow the same line. You can kind of see I'm changing that line because it's more important I get that sort of taken care of. And then I'm going to come back and inverse it again. Come back to the elliptical marquee tool, and then move the selection to the other eye. Make sure they're roughly in the same spot. And then do the same thing. Erase that out, and then inverse it, and draw in towards that center. That just makes sure that the pupil has a nice, clean edge to it, which, again, eyes are so important, and then I'm just going to deselect it. Eyes are so important because it's the first thing we look at, right? So, okay. Now, with the light source coming from above and to the right, first thing we're going to do is add a burst of highlight on the opposite side of the light source against the pupil here, all the way underneath, but not onto this side. Same thing on this side. A little burst all the way underneath. And the reason for that is anytime you're dealing with like a recess, you know, you have this edge that be catching the light, whereas this side, the side of the light source would be going into shadow right on that edge, right? So this little edge here down against the pupils in shadow on both sides. Right, so that's just that light pin pressure. And then we put that full pin pressure in as we fill in the highlights on the side of the light source, not going up to the tip, because I'm going to fade it up here, I'm going to fade it on the edge, and we're going to bring the highlight underneath and then fade it on this back side too, right? So this highlight should connect all the way over here. And really sort of fill in just that full pin pressure. Going to be backing that off as I bring that closer into here, right? Want that to sort of fade in, but connect all the way solidly into that highlight. Fade it up as we come up just a little bit. Doesn't have to be a nice neat fade. We may push that up just a little bit as well. And then fading it on that edge. Otherwise this is full highlight. So we want to make sure this full highlight comes down, right? It's really only fading as we come to the edge of it. Right, so this has that fade going on, but then this should be full highlight here. Really push that in, and then fading that over here. So I'm not putting as much pin pressure, although I'm not doing as much of a shadow as I have in other places. And you also want, right against this burst of light, it to kind of fade out into the fade, right? So I don't want that to be a burst of light that just ends. I want it to kind of gently fade into the shadow. Feather it in. I'm going to fill this all the way in with this lighter pin pressure. All the way over. And then we're going to be brightening up just a little bit the highlight as well. Bring that all the way over. Make sure it's nice and sort of tapered off. Right? Now, coming back in here and just adding more lines, brightening this up, and then pushing that on over. with a nice eye. And like I said, we can push this up if we decide to. If I decide to push some of these lines up, we could come up just a little bit more, for instance. And taper that off more, and it'll sort of fade it more extremely. I'm going to take that off for now. I don't know that that actually does anything for it at the moment. I have to find where I first did it. Oh, yep. Okay. And then make sure there's no weird gaps, right? Like here, looks a little dark in comparison to the surrounding areas. We want this to look like it belongs, like it's fading over as it comes over. So be careful though, because more lines means it's brightening it up. All right. And then that's the first eye. We'll do the same thing to the other one. We're going to have this burst of light over here, all the way underneath. And then, you know, fading out as it gets to this edge. Same thing here, fading out as it gets to this edge. Oh, that might be too bright. A little too overzealous. Otherwise, full pin pressure. And then making sure this sort of fades into highlight along that, you know, the edge of that eye. The way that makes sense. So there'll be less room right on this side because of the direction he's looking, and then fading in this area, just like we did with the other one. Making sure it's nice and sort of feathered in. And then, right, making sure this sort of fades out into shadow. I'm just backing off my pin pressure, filling in the rest of that gap. And then all of these lines, again, I mean, I'm certainly doing it in a swoop, but you can kind of see they're not straight. And for the eyes, it absolutely works. So, you know, don't worry about making a perfectly straight line. I can't draw a straight line to save my life, and I've been an artist for years. I hear that. People will say that a lot. Oh, I can never be an artist. I can't draw a straight line. Great. I can't either. But I can still, and we can all still make the illusion of depth, whether or not we can draw a straight line or not. A lot of the magic, as I've said before, a lot of the magic that we do is all in our highlights and our shadows. That's what turns us into illusionists, is our ability to take a two-dimensional object and add highlights and shadows in a way that make it appear three-dimensional. And that happens, right, all just through the highlights and shadows. I can draw the most ridiculous thing in the world, a monster or, you know, an elephant whose proportions are all out of whack, and it won't really matter. As long as I get the highlights and shadows right, it'll look good. It'll look like a three-dimensional object. So everyone can draw. It's just muscle memory, and then, you know, figuring out highlights and shadows. That can be tricky. It's certainly something you learn more and more of over time, but everyone can do this. All right, and then just like on the other one, we're gonna brighten this up. Brighten this up. And then pull back and see how it goes. See how it looks. Yeah. Now, the most important part of any composition with the eyes is adding the light flare. The light flare is just, you know, a burst of white, and I never do pure white. I'm just kind of a little bit of off-white. I'm going to take the elliptical marquee tool, and I'm going to highlight a small circle or oval. Want to make sure it's in a highlighted section, right, so I don't want to do up in here where the shadow is. And I'm going to edit and fill with the foreground color. I've already changed the white. Hit OK, and then drag it over to the other side and do the same thing. Should be in the same position against the pupil that this one was. Yeah, there we go. That is a harpy eagle. I'm going to do one last thing. I'm going to come in here, take this gray, brighten it up just a little bit on these edges. Right up in here. It's brighter on some of these edges than it is on others, and I feel like that's noticeable, so I'm just going to brighten it up. Not a lot. Just going to take it and fill in some of these gaps that make it so dark, because it kind of looks out of place to me. And if it looks out of place to me, it probably looks out of place to the people. I've learned never to assume somebody won't see it, because if you can see it as the artist, someone else can probably see it, even if they're not the artist. Always better to fix, especially if it's a glaring issue. If it's small, maybe not, but I feel like this is big enough. It's at least going to bug me enough until I fix it. Again, it's still in shadow, just like we did with, under the beak. Brightening that up just a little bit. We're doing the same here. Still in shadow, but brightening it up just a little bit. Because it's really only this lighter gray that I did it on. And just bringing it around anywhere I think it's too dark. One, to be more consistent, but two, I just think it doesn't look as good when you have the bright coming up to it. And that's how it would happen, but it seemed particularly noticeable. Yeah, I think that's better. That hides that line a little bit better. Makes it look a little bit more seamless. All right, so there is our harpy eagle. All right, so that is how you draw a harpy eagle. I hope that was helpful. In the floating nether next to me, I have other videos of art tutorials I have done, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.